This move establishes central pawn control, opens diagonals for the queen and bishop, and prepares for king's side development, initiating common strategic battles in many classical openings. By mirroring white's central pawn move with 1, d5, black establishes a symmetrical pawn center, immediately contesting control of the critical e4 and d4 squares and setting the stage for classical opening structures. This move develops a knight towards the center, preparing to control key squares and supporting potential pawn advances while aiming for a solid queen's pawn opening structure. This move develops a piece towards the center, contesting white's central pawn and preparing to castle, a fundamental principle of opening play. This move initiates the queen's gambit, a fundamental opening that aims to gain central space and pressure black's pawn on d5. This move prepares to develop the bishop to its most active square on the queenside, solidifying the central pawn structure against white's pressure. This move develops another knight, reinforcing central control and preparing to castle, a standard continuation in many queen's pawn openings like the queen's gambit declined. This move, NBD7, is a standard developing move in many queen's pawn openings, particularly the queen's gambit declined, and it prepares to support the c4 pawn if black decides to challenge white's central control with c5 or e5 later, while also freeing the way for a potential c6 pawn push. This move, bg5, is a common development in the queen's gambit declined, specifically entering variations like the Catalan or the Ragozin defense, and it aims to pressure black's knight on d7, potentially leading to pawn structure weaknesses or tactical opportunities if black is not careful with their response. This move logically follows standard queen's gambit declined theory, preparing to castle and connect the rooks while reinforcing the central pawn structure. This move solidifies white's central pawn structure, preparing to castle kingside and develop the light-squared bishop to d3 or e2, maintaining flexibility and a solid position. Castling kingside consolidates the king's safety and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard strategic goal in this queen's pawn game opening. This move prepares to control the open c-file and support a potential queenside pawn advance like b4. This move prepares to support the central pawn advance of e5 or to redeploy the rook to a more active file, potentially the c-file if white occupies it. This move develops the bishop to a natural diagonal, supporting the central pawn and preparing for potential pawn breaks in the center. Black captures the pawn on c4, a common theme in queen's gambit declined structures, aiming to temporarily simplify the position and potentially unbalance white's pawn structure after white recaptures. White recaptures the pawn, reinforcing the center and maintaining a solid pawn structure after black's exchange sacrifice. This move, a6, is a prophylactic measure, preparing to prevent white's bishop from landing on b5 with tempo after a future c6, and also potentially creating a queenside pawn majority or space for a future b5 push. This move correctly secures the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard maneuver in this queen's gambit declined structure. This pawn advance on b5 aims to gain queenside space and prepare for an expansion or potential pawn breaks, while also forcing white's bishop to a less active square. The bishop retreats to d3, a common defensive square in this variation of the queen's gambit declined, preparing to support the central pawn push e4 and potentially reposition to g5 or h6 for future attacking prospects. This move aggressively challenges white's central pawn structure and aims to open lines for black's pieces. particularly the queen and bishops, while preparing to reinforce the queenside pawn advance. This move challenges black's queenside pawn majority, aiming to disrupt their intended expansion and potentially create weaknesses after exchanges. This pawn thrust challenges white's central control and aims to gain space on the queenside, preventing white's knight from coming to c3 and potentially preparing a later pawn break with c4. This knight maneuver repositions the piece to a more active central square, aiming to potentially fork the opponent's king and queen or attack key squares while preparing for a kingside pawn advance. This capture breaks the tension in the center and opens the c-file, potentially leading to active piece play for white. This recapture re-establishes central control and prepares to exploit white's slightly loose pawn structure after black's pawn lever on the queenside. This knight maneuver aims to challenge white's central knight and improve black's piece activity, potentially preparing to recapture on d4 with the queen or a pawn. This knight sacrifice on f6 aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces by forcing a pawn capture, potentially creating weaknesses around the enemy king. Black recaptures with the bishop, maintaining a solid pawn structure and keeping the piece on the active g7 square for potential future play. The bishop repositions to e4, a natural square that maintains pressure on the queenside and offers potential support for a future kingside attack. This move prepares to activate the rook on the 7th rank, a common strategic goal in this type of queen's pawn opening structure once the central tension has resolved. This move simplifies the position by exchanging a bishop for a knight, which can be beneficial when black's knight on e5 was a strong defensive piece. And it also opens the f-file for potential future activity for white's rook. This move regains the pawn and reactivates the queen, preparing to challenge white's centralized knight. This move centralizes the queen, connecting the rooks and preparing to contest the open c-file, while also eyeing potential weaknesses on white's kingside. The knight repositions to g6, preparing to reinforce the kingside and potentially contest the crucial e5 square while also clearing the f8 square for the bishop. This move centralizes the queen, directly attacking black's rook and knight, aiming to disrupt white's harmony and potentially win material. This move is designed to centralize the queen and prepare for potential tactical exchanges on the d6 square, while also connecting the rooks. This move prepares to activate the queen into the queenside attack and puts pressure on black's queenside pawns, potentially creating imbalances. This move aims to activate the rook, which has been somewhat passive, by potentially heading towards the c-file or supporting central pawn breaks, while also freeing the bishop to find better squares. This move strategically places the bishop on a strong central square, targeting the d7 rook and preparing to support potential pawn advances while restricting black's pieces. This move prepares to reroute the rook to a more active file and defend the d6 pawn, potentially challenging white's control of the c-file. This move, qxb4, sacrifices material to open up white's queen and attack black's vulnerable kingside pawns. Black reclaims the pawn and places the rook on the central open file, aiming to contest white's queen and potentially activate its own piece. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, eyeing the f6 square and potentially preparing to challenge black's knight should it move, while also maintaining pressure on the queenside. This move initiates a pawn break to gain central space and activate the kingside pieces, challenging white's piece coordination and potentially opening lines for counterplay. This knight maneuver to c6 aims to exploit white's initiative by targeting the weakened d4 square and potentially disrupting black's coordination, while also opening lines for further piece activity. This move directly attacks white's queen and prepares to activate the rook on d8 to the center, aiming to exploit white's potentially exposed queen. This move removes black's active knight, simplifying the position and eliminating a potential attacker while also freeing white's queen from the pin on the a7-1 diagonal. The rook recaptures the pawn, centralizing itself and preparing to contest the open d-file for potential endgame advantages. The queen repositions to the 6th rank, aiming to disrupt black's rook coordination and potentially exploit the weakened light squares on the kingside after the exchange of minor pieces. This move is a reasonable attempt to regroup the queen and challenge white's active pieces. But black must be careful to coordinate their remaining forces efficiently against white's already developed queenside majority. With the rook now on an open file, this move is a logical step to centralize the piece and prepare for potential pawn pushes or further exchanges in the center. This move prepares to bring the rook into the center and contest the open f-file, which is a critical strategic goal in this position. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, aiming to pressure black's kingside and potentially prepare for a kingside pawn push or to challenge black's control of key squares. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, eyeing weaknesses on the kingside and potentially preparing to support a pawn advance. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the weakened kingside pawn structure and preparing to support a pawn push or potential attack. This pawn push aims to create space on the kingside and potentially disrupt white's pieces, although it weakens black's king safety by opening the g-file. This move aggressively repositions the rook to the 7th rank, creating significant pressure on black's position by targeting the d8 rook and threatening to infiltrate further into the enemy camp. This pawn advance challenges white's rook on c7, seeking to open lines and create attacking chances against the weakened king's position. The pawn capture on f4 is a tactical necessity, eliminating black's attacking pawn and opening the e-file, which can now be used to challenge black's pieces directly. This pawn capture opens lines for black's pieces, particularly the queen and rook, while also weakening white's kingside pawn structure and creating potential targets. This move solidifies white's king safety by preventing any immediate back rank threats, but it weakens the king's diagonal cover and may invite further pawn advances from black on the kingside. This move prepares to reposition the king to a safer square, away from the active open files and potential threats, especially with white's rook on the 7th rank. This move repositions the queen to the 5th rank, reinforcing control over the central squares and potentially preparing to contest the d-file should black's pieces become disorganized.